What is the current state of play for 2022 backdoor Roth IRAs? Hi, I'm financial planner Sean Mullaney. Let's get started. As you're probably aware, last year the House of Representatives passed a bill, the Build Back Better bill, that was voluminous, contained many tax and non-tax provisions, and one of the tax provisions was getting rid of the backdoor Roth IRA starting in 2022. So there's a lot of concern that taxpayers were not going to be able to do backdoor Roth IRAs in 2022. Then in December, Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia came out and said he was not exactly happy with the Build Back Better legislation. He wanted to take a time out on it, and it was not going to pass anytime soon. So what that meant was we could go into 2022 without any change in law, and many taxpayers, to my knowledge, have already done a backdoor Roth IRA for early 2022. So now the question becomes, where do we stand? Are there going to be any tax law changes in this regard? I think we have to think about two possibilities. One is, will Build Back Better ultimately get enacted? And then two is, if it doesn't, could the repeal of backdoor Roth IRAs get separately enacted? Early in February, Senator Manchin said that Build Back Better is dead. I take him at his word on that. So I think the Build Back Better legislation is not going to be enacted in 2022. And that really only leaves us with the potential that the backdoor Roth IRA repeal could be enacted as part of some other piece of legislation. That's easier said than done for many reasons, political reasons, the fact that we're in an election year, the fact that it would need to repass the House and pass the Senate. So I think it is exceedingly unlikely that the backdoor Roth IRA will be repealed during calendar year 2022. So for those who have already done the backdoor Roth IRA for this year, they're probably going to wind up pretty happy having done so. That said, we must at least consider the possibility that maybe I'm wrong in my prediction. Maybe somehow the backdoor Roth IRA is repealed. And if so, what would that look like for those who have already done it in 2022? I think the most likely repeal scenario, and again, I don't think repeal is a very likely scenario, but within that, the most likely repeal scenario is a prospective repeal. That means that the backdoor Roth IRA would be repealed starting in 2023. That means that those who do a backdoor Roth IRA in 2022 will have no consequence because it will still have been legal for all of 2022. No big deal. Happy to have done it. Sad it's going away in the future, but happy to have done it for 2022. That's the most likely repeal scenario. And like I said, I think any repeal scenario is very unlikely. What about another repeal scenario? What about if Congress somehow late spring, early summer passes a repeal and they make it effective upon the signature of the president, right? Essentially effective upon the enactment of the bill. So say the bill is signed June 1st, 2022, and it's effective on June 1st, 2022. That means no backdoor Roth IRAs starting on that date. That's at least a theoretically possible scenario. It would mean those people who got their backdoor Roth IRAs in January, February, March would be happy. They got it in under the wire. They're thrilled with that outcome, at least for 2022. A third repeal scenario I think is even less likely, and that would be a repeal effective January 1st, 2022. That is very unlikely for a whole host of reasons. One of them is complexity. Congress generally does not change tax laws retroactively. They do on occasion, but it's very rare, mostly because it's just so complicated to implement such a change. There's also some legal questions depending on the situation. So probably not going to happen, but let's just play it out. Let's just assume it does. What result for those people who've already done their backdoor Roth IRA for 2022? I think what would need to happen in such a scenario is the IRS and Treasury would have to write a regulation that would have a so-called transition rule. And I think that regulation would have to basically say, okay, people did a backdoor Roth IRA in early 2022. That was two steps, a non-deductible IRA contribution followed by a Roth conversion. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to create a tax law fiction, and we're going to just treat that as one step, and that one step is just a regular annual Roth IRA contribution. Then the taxpayer is going to have to go through what they call the excess Roth IRA contribution rules. What you're most likely going to do, the most likely remedy for most people, is going to be to withdraw that contribution from the Roth IRA. Remember, they probably don't qualify to have made it because they did a backdoor Roth because they don't meet the income tests, right? So they've got an excess Roth IRA contribution under that scenario. They're going to need to withdraw the contribution and the earnings attributable to that contribution. Here's the thing about those earnings. They're subject to ordinary income tax when they're withdrawn from that Roth IRA as a corrective distribution. That means we have a sort of a measure of the downside of this, right? What if everything goes wrong, Congress actually enacts the repeal, and it's retroactive? It means probably you're going to get taxed on the earnings that those contributions generated. Those contributions in a relatively short period of time are not likely to generate a ton of earnings. So let's play this out. Married couple, each does a $6,000 backdoor Roth IRA for 2022 in January. In June, they repeal, let's just use June as a repeal date, retroactive back to January 1st. So they repeal the backdoor Roth IRA. This couple wants to take corrective action so they don't get any penalties. What they would need to do is they would need to withdraw the $6,000 contribution they each made plus the earnings attributable to it. Now, it might be that the stock market's down and there aren't that many earnings, if any, and there'd be no taxable income from that event. But let's just say their investment, for whatever reason, does particularly well. They withdraw it in July, and it's now grown 10%, right? So the $12,000 that was put into the two Roth IRAs is now worth $13,200. That's $1,200 of earnings. They would need to withdraw the $1,200 of earnings plus the $12,000 of contributions, and the $1,200 of earnings would now be taxable on their 2022 tax return. Nobody wants to pay tax on $1,200, right? Nobody wants to do that. But as a downside, boy, that doesn't seem like the worst outcome in the world, right? You get the money back, you pay a little tax, you move on with your life. And that's assuming an investment that does really, really well in 6 or 7 months grows by 10%. That's a pretty good investment. So what I'm here to tell you is the way I assess the risk here, and you got to do your own risk assessment on a 2022 backdoor Roth IRA, but the way I view it is the downside is not that bad, and it's not all that likely to happen. Let me know what you think in the comments about the 2022 backdoor Roth IRA, and please like, share, and subscribe this video. See you next time.